December 16, 1944. The frozen Ardennes forest. A single rifle shot echoes through the snow-covered pines, and 15 seconds later, a German tank commander collapses dead in his hatch. But here's what's strange. Nobody heard where that shot came from. Not the other tank crews, not the German infantry nearby, not even the Allied troops who should have been watching their own sniper's position. That silence wasn't an accident. It was the result of one American sniper's unauthorized modification. A piece of battlefield engineering that violated direct orders, broke military regulations, and might have changed the way acoustic warfare was fought in World War II. This is the story of how desperation, ingenuity, and a coffee can turned the bloodiest battle in American history into something no one expected, a whisper war. To understand why this matters, we need to go back 6 months before the Battle of the Bulge, to the hedgerows of Normandy, where American snipers were learning a brutal lesson about sound. In June 1944, the doctrine was clear. Snipers took one shot, eliminated the target, and immediately relocated. The muzzle flash and the crack of a rifle gave away your position instantly. Every sniper manual, every training course, every veteran instructor hammered this into recruits. One shot, one kill, one relocation. The sound of your rifle was a death sentence if you stayed put. But there was a problem with this doctrine, and it was getting men killed. The terrain of occupied Europe wasn't like the open ranges where American snipers trained. The hedgerows of Normandy were dense, maze-like walls of earth and vegetation. The forests of Belgium were thick with undergrowth. Finding a good sniper position took hours. Setting up proper sight lines, escape routes, and camouflage was exhausting work. And doing it over and over again, multiple times per day, meant snipers spent more time moving than shooting. Worse, every relocation was an opportunity to be spotted. Every time you packed up and moved, you exposed yourself to counter-snipers, to random patrols, to the 1,000 accidents of war that killed careful men. The doctrine assumed you had space to maneuver. But in the close-quarters combat of European forests, space was the one thing snipers didn't have. Some snipers started bending the rules. They'd take 2 shots instead of 1 before moving. Then 3. They'd rationalize it. If the targets were far enough away, if the forest was dense enough, if they were careful about angles, maybe they could get away with it. Most of them learned the hard way that they couldn't. German counter-sniper doctrine was sophisticated. They used acoustic triangulation, multiple observer posts, and patient hunters who knew how to track a sound back to its source. The casualty rates told the story. By autumn 1944, American sniper teams were being neutralized at alarming rates, not because their marksmanship was poor, but because the fundamental nature of rifle acoustics gave them away. A Springfield M11903, or an M1 Garand, created a distinctive crack that traveled for miles through forest air. That crack was a beacon, a signal flare that said, "I am here, come kill me." And this is where our story truly begins, because one sniper in particular started to wonder, what if the sound was the problem? What if instead of accepting that rifles were loud, you changed the rifle itself? His name has been lost to history, or perhaps deliberately obscured, because what he was about to do was completely illegal under military law. The regulations about weapon modifications in World War II were strict, and for good reason. The United States military had learned bitter lessons in previous wars about soldiers tinkering with their firearms. Unauthorized modifications could cause misfires, reduce accuracy, or catastrophically fail at critical moments. A rifle that blew up in your hands didn't just kill you, it potentially compromised your entire unit. So the rules were simple. You could clean your weapon, maintain it, and perform authorized repairs. But modification, alteration, adding unauthorized components, that was a court-martial offense. The weapons you were issued had been tested, standardized, and approved through rigorous protocols. Changing them meant taking responsibility for what happened next. and the military had no patience for soldiers who thought they knew better than the engineers. But here's what the engineers didn't know. They'd never tried to solve the problem of sustained sniper operations in dense European forests against an enemy with sophisticated acoustic tracking. They'd designed weapons for the wars they'd already fought, not the one that was actually happening. This particular sniper had served through Normandy and the liberation of France. He'd lost friends to counter-sniper fire. He'd watched good shooters get triangulated and eliminated because they couldn't shoot without announcing their presence. And at some point during the autumn of 1944, probably during a cold night in a forward position somewhere in eastern France, he started thinking about a weapon he'd heard rumors about. The well-rod pistol, British Special Operations executive, integrally suppressed, used by commandos and resistance fighters for quiet eliminations. He'd never seen one, but he'd heard the stories. A pistol so quiet you could fire it in a room, and people in the next room wouldn't hear it. The British had technology that made silence possible, but the well-rod was classified. It wasn't available to regular infantry, and certainly not to American forces who weren't conducting special operations. If silence was possible, it wasn't going to come from official channels, which meant it would have to be improvised. The physics of sound suppression had been understood since before World War I. Hiram Percy Maxim had patented the first commercial suppressor in WWII 1909. The basic principle was simple. Slow down and cool the expanding gases that exit the barrel behind a bullet. Do that, and you reduce the acoustic signature dramatically. But there was a massive gap between understanding the principle and actually building something that worked. Commercial suppressors were precision machine devices made from specialized materials. They required exact tolerances, proper baffling systems, and materials that could withstand repeated exposure to hot gases and pressure. Getting it wrong meant the suppressor could literally explode, sending shrapnel back into the shooter's face. Our sniper didn't have access to machine shops. He didn't have engineering blueprints. He didn't have specialized materials. What he had was whatever he could scrounge from supply dumps and abandoned buildings. And somehow, using materials that were never intended for this purpose, he started experimenting. The details of his first attempts have been lost, but we can reconstruct what likely happened based on the physics involved and the materials available to frontline soldiers in 1944. He probably started with the simplest possible approach, packing material around the barrel to absorb sound. Cloth, perhaps, or steel wool, anything that might muffle the blast. That wouldn't have worked. The problem isn't sound traveling through the air around the barrel. It's the supersonic shockwave of gases exploding out of the muzzle. You need to contain and redirect those gases, not just muffle them. So he probably moved on to the idea of an expansion chamber, something attached to the end of the barrel that would give the gases space to expand and cool before hitting open air. And this is where the coffee can enter our story. Metal containers were everywhere in military supply chains. Ration cans, ammunition boxes, coffee tins, they were disposable, replaceable, and most importantly, nobody tracked them. A can that went missing from the mess supplies wouldn't be investigated, and a coffee can, with its cylindrical shape and removable lid, had almost the right geometry for what he needed. The concept was crude, but theoretically sound. If you could attach a sealed cylinder to the end of your rifle barrel, drill a hole for the bullet to pass through, and create some kind of baffling system inside to slow the expanding gases, you might be able to reduce the acoustic signature enough to matter, but the devil was in the details. How do you attach a can to a rifle barrel without it flying off from the pressure? How do you seal it? How do you create baffles? How do you ensure the bullet passes through cleanly without hitting the sides of the can, which would send it tumbling and destroy your accuracy? According to the fragments of information that survived, he used wire to secure the can to the barrel. Multiple wrappings of strong wire, twisted tight, possibly with some kind of packing material to create a seal. The baffling system was probably improvised from whatever materials he could find. More steel wool, perhaps? Or crushed metal discs cut from other cans? Stacked and spaced inside the coffee tin. It would have looked absurd. A professional weapons engineer would have laughed at it. But the question wasn't whether it looked professional. The question was, did it work? And here's where the story gets interesting, because testing an unauthorized weapon modification in a combat zone is problematic for obvious reasons. You can't exactly walk up to your commanding officer and say, "Hey, I built an illegal silencer. Can I test fire it at the range?" So he had to test it in the field, which meant the first time he really knew whether his improvised suppressor worked was probably the first time he fired it at an enemy target. December 16, 1944. Germany launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, the last major offensive campaign on the Western Front. 250,000 German troops, hundreds of tanks, and massive artillery support smashed into a lightly defended section of the American line in the Ardennes forest of Belgium. The Americans called it the Battle of the Bulge, because the German advance created a massive bulge in the Allied lines, a penetration that threatened to split the Allied forces in two and potentially reach the port of Antwerp. The initial assault was chaos. American units were overrun, surrounded, or scattered. Communication lines were cut. Command structure broke down. In some sectors, soldiers didn't know whether they were advancing, retreating, or surrounded. The weather was terrible. Freezing temperatures, snow, fog that grounded Allied air support, and gave the Germans complete freedom of movement. This was the worst possible situation for conventional military operations. But for a sniper operating outside the normal command structure, it created a strange kind of opportunity. Our sniper, along with his unit, found himself pulled into the maelstrom. Units were being rushed to plug gaps in the line. The 101st Airborne was sent to hold Bastogne. Other divisions were scrambling to establish defensive positions. And somewhere in this chaos, in a forest near one of the key crossroads, our sniper set up in a position overlooking a German supply route. This is where the coffee can suppressor was about to receive its real-world test. The German advance depended on speed and momentum. Tank columns were pushing forward along every available road, trying to exploit the breakthrough before American reinforcements could arrive. And tanks, unlike infantry, had a critical vulnerability. They were commanded by officers who had to expose themselves to see the battlefield. Tank commanders fought with their heads out of the turret hatch. It was the only way to maintain situational awareness, to spot threats, to direct the crew. A closed-hatch tank was nearly blind. So despite the obvious danger, tank commanders rode into combat exposed. This made them perfect sniper targets. Kill the commander, and the tank was effectively neutralized. The crew might continue forward, but without leadership and vision, they were vulnerable to anti-tank teams, prone to mistakes, and far less effective in combat. But there was a problem. Tank columns traveled together. If you shot one commander, the others would button up, dropping into their hatches and closing the armor. They'd know a sniper was active. They'd call for infantry support, smoke screens, suppressive fire. You might get one kill before the entire column became untouchable. Unless they never heard the shot. Our sniper, positioned in the tree line with his modified rifle, watched the German column approach. Multiple tanks, commanders exposed, moving at the careful pace of an advance through potentially hostile territory. This was the moment. If the suppressor worked, he could engage multiple targets. If it didn't, if the shot rang out like a normal rifle crack, he'd get one kill and then he'd have to run for his life. He aimed. Controlled breathing. Sight picture. The fundamentals drilled into every sniper. Smooth trigger press. Follow through. Don't anticipate the recoil. The rifle fired. Here's what should have happened. A sharp crack echoing through the forest. Heads turning. The tank column stopping. Infantry deploying. Counter-sniper protocols activating. Here's what actually happened. The German commander slumped in his hatch. The tank continued forward for several seconds before the crew realized something was wrong and the tank lurched to a halt. The other tanks kept moving. No one took cover. No one scanned the tree line. The column thought their commander had suffered a medical emergency, or maybe caught a stray piece of shrapnel from somewhere. But they didn't think sniper, because they hadn't heard the shot. The coffee can suppressor had reduced the Springfield's acoustic signature to something that didn't register as rifle fire. It wasn't silent. Physics doesn't allow for true silence when you're dealing with supersonic projectiles and explosive propellant. But it was quiet enough that in the ambient noise of a battlefield, with engines running and equipment rattling and wind blowing through trees, the shot didn't announce itself. He chambered another round, acquired the next target, fired again, another commander down. The column was still moving, now with visible confusion. Tanks were stopping, crews were dismounting, but they weren't taking defensive positions. They were trying to understand what was happening. Medical emergency? Coordinated heart attacks? Some kind of new weapon they hadn't encountered? By the time the German infantry began to suspect sniper activity, 3 tank commanders were dead, and the column was in disarray, and our sniper was still in his original position. No relocation. No frantic escape through the forest. Just methodical target acquisition and engagement from a position the enemy couldn't identify. This should have been impossible. This violated everything snipers knew about acoustic warfare. But the coffee can strapped to his rifle had changed the equation. Word spread fast in combat zones, but not through official channels. Soldiers talk. They share information in ways that bypass the command structure. If something works, if someone has figured out an edge that keeps people alive, that knowledge moves through the ranks like wildfire. Other snipers started hearing about it. A guy who was getting multiple kills without relocating, a modification that made rifles quiet. At first, it sounded like combat mythology, the kind of tall tale that soldiers told to boost morale. But then more reports came in. Different sectors, different units, all describing the same thing. Silent sniper operations that were neutralizing German positions without giving away the shooter's location. The technical details were probably passed along in hushed conversations during brief rest periods. How to attach the can, what materials to use for baffling, how to ensure the bullet's path stayed clear. It was battlefield engineering, passed from soldier to soldier, refined through trial and error, improved by men who understood that their survival depended on making this work. And it did work, but not perfectly. Improvised suppressors had serious limitations. They reduced accuracy because the added weight at the end of the barrel changed the harmonics of the rifle. They couldn't handle sustained fire because the heat buildup would eventually degrade whatever materials were being used for baffling. They required constant maintenance and replacement because they weren't built from materials designed for this application. But here's the thing about combat. Perfect is the enemy of good enough. A suppressor that reduced accuracy by 20%, but allowed you to take 5 shots instead of 1, that was worth it. A device that had to be rebuilt after every mission but kept you alive during that mission. Absolutely worth it. Not every sniper adopted the modification. Some were purists who didn't trust anything that hadn't been officially approved. Others worried, correctly, that if they were caught with an unauthorized modification, they'd face serious consequences. And some simply didn't have the materials or the technical knowledge to build one that worked. But enough snipers adopted it that it began to change the tactical dynamics in their sectors. German forces started reporting something strange. Casualties among tank commanders and forward observers without corresponding sniper fire. Losses that couldn't be attributed to artillery or airstrikes or normal infantry combat. Officers who died from single rifle shots, but no one could identify where the shots came from. The German counter-sniper doctrine, which had been very effective throughout the war, suddenly had a problem. Acoustic triangulation doesn't work if you can't hear the shot. Observer posts can't track muzzle flashes if they don't know which sector to watch. Sniper hunters can't hunt what they can't locate. Some German units began to suspect a new American weapon system. Intelligence reports started circulating about possible advanced suppressor technology being deployed to American snipers. They weren't entirely wrong, but they also weren't right. It wasn't advanced technology. It was improvisation born from necessity and desperation. The psychological impact shouldn't be underestimated. Soldiers can deal with visible threats. You can take cover from machine gun fire. You can call for artillery support against a known position. You can maneuver around an enemy you can see. But an invisible sniper? Someone who can kill repeatedly without giving away their location? That's a different kind of threat. German tank commanders started staying buttoned up more often, which reduced their effectiveness. Forward observers became more cautious, which degraded German artillery coordination. Officers hesitated to expose themselves, which impacted command and control. The whisper war was having effects that rippled far beyond the individual kills. But back in the American command structure, there was a problem brewing. Because while the snipers on the front lines were celebrating their newfound tactical advantage, someone in the chain of command had noticed the reports of modified weapons. Military regulations existed for reasons that went beyond simple bureaucracy. Weapon modifications could fail catastrophically. They could cause injuries to friendly forces. They could violate international laws of warfare. And perhaps most importantly, from an institutional perspective, they represented soldiers making independent decisions about equipment that was supposed to be standardized and controlled. When the reports reached a certain level of the command structure, probably at division or corps level, some officer made the decision that this had to be investigated and stopped. The order came down. All unauthorized weapon modifications are to be reported and removed immediately. Soldiers found with modified weapons will face disciplinary action up to and including court-martial. This put field commanders in an impossible position. On one hand, they had explicit orders from higher headquarters. On the other hand, they had snipers who were being more effective than they'd been in months, in the middle of the most critical battle of the war. Some commanders enforced the order strictly. They confiscated the improvised suppressors, documented the violations, and prepared disciplinary paperwork. Those snipers went back to standard doctrine. One shot, immediate relocation, constant movement. Other commanders looked at the tactical situation and made a calculated decision to ignore the order. They didn't explicitly approve the modifications, but they also didn't look too closely at their snipers' equipment. They maintained plausible deniability while allowing their most effective soldiers to continue doing what worked. And then there were the snipers themselves, who had to make a personal choice, follow orders, and give up a tactical advantage that was keeping them alive, or continue using illegal modifications and risk court-martial if they survived the battle. Our original sniper, the one who'd built the first coffee can suppressor, was apparently among those who refused to stop. According to the fragments of information that survived, he continued using his modified weapon throughout the Battle of the Bulge, racking up an impressive number of confirmed kills, particularly among German tank commanders and officers. The moral calculation he made was probably simple. The chance of court-martial was less concerning than the certainty of death if he went back to standard operations. He'd seen what happened to snipers who gave away their positions. He'd attended enough memorial services. The coffee can stayed on his rifle. Let's talk about what was actually happening, acoustically, when these improvised suppressors were fired. Because understanding the physics helps explain both why they worked and why they had limitations. A rifle shot creates sound from multiple sources. There's the mechanical action of the firing pin striking the primer. There's the supersonic crack of the bullet itself breaking the sound barrier. And there's the muzzle blast, which is the explosive release of propellant gases from the end of the barrel. The mechanical noise is relatively quiet and impossible to suppress without redesigning the entire action mechanism. The supersonic crack can't be suppressed at all. It's a function of the bullet's velocity, and if you slow the bullet down enough to go subsonic, you lose range and hitting power. That wasn't an option for sniper operations. But the muzzle blast? That's where suppression is possible. The muzzle blast is what most people think of as the gun being loud. It's the explosive boom that echoes for miles. And it's caused by hot, high-pressure gases expanding rapidly when they exit the barrel behind the bullet. A suppressor works by giving those gases more time and space to expand and cool before they hit open air. Imagine opening a champagne bottle. If you pop the cork, you get a loud bang and fizz everywhere. But if you slowly ease the cork out, allowing the pressure to bleed off gradually, the release is much quieter. The coffee can suppressor was doing something similar. The baffling inside, whatever material was being used, created turbulence and resistance that slowed the gas expansion. The volume of the can gave the gases space to cool slightly before exiting. And the result was that instead of an explosive crack echoing through the forest, you got something much quieter. It wasn't silent. The bullet was still supersonic, so there was still the crack of the sonic boom, and some muzzle blast still occurred. But the acoustic signature was reduced enough that in the ambient noise of a battlefield, it didn't register as rifle fire to listeners who weren't specifically expecting it. The effective range of hearing was probably reduced from miles to hundreds of yards, maybe less depending on terrain and conditions. Close enough that if German soldiers were right on top of the sniper position, they'd still hear something. But far enough that tank commanders a few hundred yards away didn't connect the sound with incoming fire. This acoustic camouflage was the key to everything. It didn't make snipers invisible, but it made them much harder to locate. And in sniper warfare, location is everything. However, the improvised nature of these suppressors meant they had serious performance issues. Commercial suppressors are built with precision-machined baffles, often using a combination of expansion chambers and directional ports that maximize gas cooling while minimizing back pressure on the rifle's action. The coffee can versions had none of that sophistication. The baffling was crude. The materials weren't designed for repeated exposure to extreme heat and pressure. After sustained use, the packing material inside would compress, melt, or degrade, reducing effectiveness. The can itself might develop cracks or weak points. The wire securing it to the barrel could loosen from repeated recoil. Snipers using these devices had to constantly monitor their condition and rebuild them as needed. Some sources suggest they were essentially disposable, rebuilt after every mission or even after every few shots. The maintenance burden was significant, but again, it was worth it for the tactical advantage. There was also the question of legality under international law. The Hague Conventions and Geneva Conventions had specific provisions about weapons designed to cause unnecessary suffering. Suppressors themselves weren't illegal, but there was always a question about whether modified weapons might violate various provisions. In practice, this wasn't a significant concern. The improvised suppressors didn't change the lethality of the ammunition or cause wounds that were different from standard rifle fire. They just made the rifle quieter. But the fact that lawyers and military legal advisors were even asking the question tells you how far outside normal procedure these modifications were as the Battle of the Bulge progressed through late December and into January. The tactical situation evolved. The German offensive, after initial success, had stalled. American reinforcements were arriving. The weather cleared enough for Allied air power to enter the fight. The German forces, already overextended and short on fuel, began to retreat. In this changing battlefield, the role of snipers shifted. Early in the battle, when German forces were advancing and American units were scattered, snipers had operated in a more independent mode, harassing enemy columns and taking targets of opportunity. But as the American defense solidified and counteroffensives began, snipers were integrated back into more conventional operations. The improvised suppressors became less critical in this phase. When you're advancing with infantry support and artillery coordination, the tactical need for acoustic stealth is reduced. The benefits of silent shooting still existed, but the desperation that had driven their adoption in the first place was fading. Some snipers removed their improvised suppressors at this point, either voluntarily or because commanders finally enforced the prohibition orders now that the crisis had passed. Others kept them, reasoning that the tactical advantage was worth maintaining. What happened to our original sniper, the innovator with the coffee can? The historical record is frustratingly vague. There are no confirmed names, no detailed after-action reports, no official recognition of his innovation. This might be because the modification was illegal and therefore never officially documented. It might be because he didn't survive the battle. Or it might be because someone in the command structure decided that officially acknowledging illegal weapon modifications, even successful ones, would set a dangerous precedent. What we do know is that the Battle of the Bulge ended in late January 1945 with a decisive Allied victory. The German offensive had failed. The road to Germany was open. And among the thousands of after-action reports and lessons learned documents that were filed in the aftermath, there's no official mention of improvised suppressors being used by American snipers. The absence is conspicuous. We know from multiple sources that these modifications were used. We have fragmentary accounts from soldiers who saw them or heard about them. We have German intelligence reports noting unusual American sniper activity. But in the official American records, nothing? This might be institutional embarrassment. The military doesn't like admitting that soldiers violated orders and succeeded because of it. It raises uncomfortable questions about whether the orders were correct in the first place, or it might be operational security. If the improvised suppressor technique was effective, and if there was potential to develop it into an official weapon system, you wouldn't want to advertise it publicly. Better to classify it, study it quietly, and potentially weaponize it properly for future conflicts. But what happened after the war? Did the improvised suppressor innovation lead to any official developments? The answer is complicated. The United States military did eventually adopt suppressor technology for specific applications, but not until much later. The Delisle carbine, which the British had developed during the war, demonstrated that integral suppressors on rifles were viable. But American adoption was slow. During the Vietnam War, suppressed weapons finally entered mainstream American military use. The Navy SEALs used suppressed Swedish Carl Gustaf submachine guns. Special operations units deployed with suppressed M16s and suppressed pistols. Sniper rifles began to be fitted with commercial suppressors that were actually designed for the application rather than improvised from coffee cans. But here's the interesting question. Did the coffee can innovator from the Battle of the Bulge influence any of this? Did his improvised solution eventually make its way into official research and development? There's no direct evidence of a connection. The official history of American suppressor development doesn't mention battlefield improvisation from World War II. The engineers who designed the Vietnam-era suppressors were working from established acoustic principles and commercial suppressor technology that had existed since before World War I. But there's a persistent rumor in military, small arms circles that some of the Vietnam-era development was informed by classified after-action reports from World War II that documented successful field modifications. The rumor suggests that while the official records were scrubbed of references to illegal weapon modifications, classified technical intelligence reports preserved the details for future reference. It's impossible to verify this. The relevant documents, if they exist, would be buried in classified archives. The engineers who worked on early military suppressor projects are mostly deceased, and the institutional memory of why certain design choices were made has faded. What we can say definitively is this. The coffee can suppressor from the Battle of the Bulge demonstrated that sound suppression on rifles was tactically valuable enough that soldiers were willing to violate orders and risk court-martial to achieve it. That lesson, whether officially acknowledged or not, eventually influenced the military's decision to pursue suppressor technology seriously. Let's zoom out and think about what this story really represents. It's not just about one sniper and a coffee can. It's about the tension between institutional control and battlefield innovation. Military organizations have to standardize. They have to create regulations, enforce compliance, and ensure that equipment meets certain standards. This is how you maintain a functional fighting force with millions of moving parts. You can't have every soldier improvising their own solutions because that leads to chaos, incompatibility, and preventable failures. But military organizations also have to adapt. They have to respond to threats and situations that weren't anticipated by the regulations. They have to allow for innovation at the tactical level because the soldiers actually fighting the war often understand the problems better than the staff officers writing the doctrine. The coffee can suppressor represents the moment when those two imperatives collided. The institutional imperative said, "No unauthorized modifications, period." The tactical imperative said, "This modification is keeping people alive and helping us win firefights." In some sense, both sides were right. The regulations about weapon modifications were reasonable, and unauthorized tinkering with rifles really could lead to catastrophic failures. But the sniper who built the suppressor was also right that the standard doctrine wasn't working and that a modified weapon offered a tactical advantage worth pursuing. Chatulfuend, resolution of this conflict varied by unit and commander. Some chose regulations over results. Others chose results over regulations. And the soldiers themselves had to navigate this terrain, knowing that they could face punishment for doing something that demonstrably worked. This pattern repeats throughout military history. In Vietnam, soldiers duct-taped magazines together for faster reloading, which was technically unauthorized, but became so universal that the military eventually developed official dual magazine clamps. In Iraq and Afghanistan, soldiers added unauthorized armor to vehicles, leading eventually to the development of better protected vehicle designs. In every conflict, there's a push and pull between what soldiers actually need and what the system is prepared to give them. The coffee can suppressor is just one example, but it's a particularly dramatic one because of the stakes involved. This wasn't a quality-of-life improvement or a minor tactical tweak. This was a modification that changed the fundamental nature of sniper warfare in the sectors where it was used. There's another dimension to this story that's worth examining, the psychological and ethical dimension. Our sniper made a choice to disobey orders, and that choice had consequences beyond just his own court-martial risk. Every time he fired his suppressed rifle, he was taking an enemy soldier's life in a way that the enemy couldn't anticipate or defend against. The German tank commanders who died probably never knew what hit them. They didn't hear the shot, didn't see the muzzle flash, had no warning that a sniper had them targeted. In one sense, this is just sniper work. Snipers always aim to kill before the target knows they're there. The whole point is to eliminate the enemy without giving them a chance to respond. That's not murder. That's warfare conducted within the accepted rules of engagement. But the suppressor added an extra dimension of invisibility that some might argue crossed an ethical line. There's something about completely silent killing that feels qualitatively different from regular sniper work, even though the practical difference is minimal. Our sniper would have had to wrestle with this. Was he a soldier doing his duty more effectively? Or was he doing something that violated the unwritten rules of honorable combat? The answer probably depended on his personal philosophy and how he understood the nature of warfare. The reality is that warfare constantly pushes ethical boundaries. Every new technology, from the crossbow to the machine gun to nuclear weapons, has provoked debates about whether it crosses some moral line. And soldiers in the field rarely have the luxury of extended philosophical contemplation. They make decisions based on survival, mission success, and the immediate tactical situation. Our sniper chose survival and mission success. He chose to give himself and his fellow soldiers a better chance of winning engagements and going home alive. Whether that choice was ethically justified is something historians and philosophers can debate. But in the frozen forests of Belgium in December 1944, with German tanks rolling forward and American forces desperately trying to hold the line, he probably didn't have time for those debates. He built a suppressor. He used it. It worked. And whether that makes him a tactical genius or a soldier who violated the rules of war probably depends on your perspective. Let's bring this full circle and think about the legacy of this innovation. What did the coffee can suppressor actually accomplish? On a tactical level, it gave individual snipers and small units a temporary advantage in acoustic warfare. It allowed for sustained engagement from fixed positions. It complicated German counter-sniper operations. It probably saved American lives and contributed to the ultimate Allied victory in the Battle of the Bulge. On a technological level, it demonstrated that sound suppression on rifles was achievable with relatively simple technology. It showed that the acoustic signature of a rifle was a solvable problem, not an inherent limitation of the weapon system. And while the specific coffee can design was crude and improvised, it proved the concept. On an institutional level, it highlighted the gap between official doctrine and battlefield reality. It showed that soldiers would innovate around regulations if they felt their survival depended on it. And it potentially influenced, in ways we can't fully document, the later development of official suppressor programs. But perhaps most importantly, it's a reminder that war is ultimately fought by individuals making decisions in extreme circumstances. The grand strategies and battle plans matter, but so do the choices made by a single sniper in a frozen forest, who decided that the rules didn't make sense and that he was going to try something different. The military is, by necessity, a conservative institution. It has to be. You can't have everyone doing their own thing. But that conservatism has to be balanced against the reality that innovation often comes from the edges, from the people actually dealing with problems that headquarters didn't anticipate. The coffee can suppressor is one of those edge innovations. It was never officially sanctioned. It never became standard issue. The man who invented it probably never received a medal or official recognition. But for a brief period during the bloodiest battle in American history, it changed how war was fought in certain sectors of the line. There's a postscript to this story that's worth mentioning. In the decades after World War II, as the official records were declassified and veterans began telling their stories more openly, fragments of information about the improvised suppressors began to surface. Veteran reunions would sometimes include discussions of the various field modifications soldiers had made. Old snipers would mention, almost casually, that they'd attached things to their barrels to make them quieter. Historians researching the Battle of the Bulge would occasionally find references in personal letters or diaries to unusual sniper operations. None of this made it into the mainstream historical narrative. The standard histories of the Battle of the Bulge focus on Bastogne, on Patton's relief column, on the heroic defense and eventual victory. There's no chapter on acoustic warfare or improvised suppressors, but in the more specialized literature, in the books written by and for small arms enthusiasts and military technology historians, the story persists. It's usually told as a rumor or an unconfirmed account because the hard documentation doesn't exist. But enough different sources mention it, with enough consistent details, that it's almost certainly true. Someone, probably multiple someones, built improvised suppressors during the Battle of the Bulge. They used them in combat. They achieved results that wouldn't have been possible with standard equipment. And then, because what they'd done was technically illegal, the story was quietly buried in the official records. This happens more often than you might think in military history. The innovations that come from the bottom up, from soldiers solving problems in unauthorized ways, often don't get documented because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging that the soldiers broke rules. It's easier for the institution to pretend it didn't happen, but the truth has a way of persisting. Stories get told. Veterans remember. And eventually, decades later, historians piece together what actually happened from the fragmentary evidence that survived. So what should we take away from the story of the coffee can suppressor? First, that necessity really is the mother of invention. Our sniper didn't build his suppressor because he was interested in acoustic engineering as an intellectual exercise. He built it because the standard doctrine was getting people killed, and he wanted a better solution. When survival is on the line, people become remarkably creative. Second, that institutional rules have to be balanced against practical reality. The prohibition on weapon modifications was reasonable in principle, but it didn't account for the specific circumstances of sniper operations in the Battle of the Bulge. Rigid enforcement of that prohibition would have reduced tactical effectiveness. Smart commanders understood this and found ways to look the other way. Third, that individual initiative matters even in large institutional contexts, like military organizations. One sniper's innovation rippled out to affect tactics across multiple units. His willingness to break rules and take risks created opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Fourth, that technology doesn't always progress in straight lines through official channels. Sometimes the breakthrough comes from someone improvising with materials that were never intended for that application. Sometimes the crude prototype built in a foxhole teaches lessons that take decades to make it into official procurement programs. And finally, that history often misses these kinds of stories. The coffee can suppressor should be in every history of the Battle of the Bulge. It should be taught in military innovation courses. The sniper who built it should have a name and a recognition that matches his contribution. But instead, it's a footnote, a rumor, a story that gets told in certain circles but never makes it into the official narrative. That's a loss for historical understanding. It means we're not learning lessons we should be learning about how innovation actually happens in wartime. December 16, 1944, to January 25, 1945. 6 weeks of brutal winter combat in the Ardennes forest. 20,000 Americans killed, 80,000 total casualties. The largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II. Somewhere in those 6 weeks, in some frozen foxhole or sniper hide, a soldier wrapped wire around a coffee can and strapped it to his rifle. He violated military regulations. He risked court-martial. He improvised a solution to a problem that the official system hadn't solved. And for a brief moment in that terrible winter, some part of the battlefield went quiet. Tank commanders died without warning. German officers fell without the crack of a rifle to mark where the shot came from. The whisper war had begun. The coffee can didn't win the Battle of the Bulge. The Allied victory came from strategy, logistics, overwhelming firepower, and the courage of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. But in its own small way, in the sectors where it was used, the improvised suppressor changed the tactical equation. It gave American snipers an edge they hadn't had before. It complicated German operations. It saved lives. And then it vanished from the official record, leaving behind only fragments and rumors and the persistent story of one sniper's illegal innovation. This is how wars are actually fought. Not just with the official weapons and approved tactics, but with improvisation and adaptation, and soldiers who refuse to accept that the way things are is the way things have to be. The coffee can suppressor was crude, illegal, and improvised. It was also ingenious, effective, and necessary. It violated regulations but saved lives. It never received official recognition, but influenced future development. That's the paradox at the heart of this story. The innovation that mattered couldn't be acknowledged. The soldier who made the breakthrough couldn't be rewarded. The tactical advantage that worked couldn't be officially documented. Because sometimes, in the chaos and desperation of combat, the right thing to do is also the prohibited thing. And the people who have the courage to do it anyway, who take the risk and face the consequences, those people change history, even if history never records their names. Somewhere in the archives, in a classified document that may or may not still exist, there might be a technical report about improvised suppressors used in the Ardennes, or maybe not. Maybe the whole story was deliberately forgotten because acknowledging it would be too complicated, would raise too many uncomfortable questions about doctrine and regulations and whether the system actually serves the soldiers it's supposed to support. Either way, the coffee can suppressor was real. The sniper who built it was real. The kills he made with it were real. And for 6 weeks in the winter of 1944 and 1945, part of the Battle of the Bulge was fought as a whisper war, with German soldiers dying to shots they never heard from positions they couldn't locate. That's the story that should be remembered. That's the innovation that should be studied. That's the lesson about improvisation and adaptation and individual initiative in the face of institutional rigidity. One sniper, one coffee can, one illegal modification that changed tactical warfare for the soldiers who used it. The Battle of the Bulge turned into a whisper war, and almost nobody knows it happened.